Alright, in this video I'm going to talk about Kant's Transcendental Deduction of the categories. And he gives two different ones depending on the edition of the Critique of Pure Reason that you read. So he has a first edition and a second edition, and they both give similar but different arguments for the Transcendental Deduction of the categories. I had originally planned and even wrote out notes for doing both of them, but I think for the sake of time and clarity, I'm going to just focus on the second edition. So, second edition. I will leave a pinned comment with essentially my notes for the first edition Transcendental Deduction of the categories, but I think just focusing on the second edition version of the argument will cut down on time for one thing, but also make it clearer. It'll be less confusing. And so, I mean, I'll kind of mix them a little bit too, because I think some of the stuff he talks about in the first edition makes some of the things in the second edition clearer if you kind of bring those ideas into it. And so in the second edition, he starts by establishing what he calls apperception. Well, I guess first what I'll say is sort of give an idea of what a transcendental deduction is. So a transcendental argument is essentially saying that that something A is true, that we take it for granted that this is true, and then we want to find out what conditions, what things also have to be true in order for A to obtain. And so what he's doing in this argument essentially is saying that that our perception of things in the world is intelligible. So when we look at, and I've used in the previous video the example of a tree, so we have a tree here. When we look at this, what makes we take it for sgranted that we don't just see, that we don't just sort of experience this weird, splotch of colors and shapes and everything here, and that it's not the fact that it sort of means nothing to us, that we have meaning here, that by saying that this is a tree and having some concept of what a tree is taken for granted. And so, it's taken as sort of self-evident, I guess would maybe be a better term for it. And so he's trying to deduce what conditions must hold in order for that to be true. All right, so in the argument in the second edition, he starts with this idea of apperception, and I'll go through a few points here to kind of define what this is and why we need it. So the first point, and he doesn't enumerate it this way, this is just the way that I did it while going through the book. And so he says that pure sensibility, which is, like I said, it's if we looked at this tree here and it was just kind of a weird splotch of colors and shapes that didn't have any meaning, so that would be what pure sensibility is. So does not present our sense data, so the data in combination. It does not present it in combination. And in the first edition, he actually talks about this more explicitly in terms of time. And so he says in the first edition that if we look at the tree here, we look at the tree and we have some sort of immediate sensation of it, but we also have sensations of it from the past. So we could have, if we say that t0, time zero, is right now, we also have it from t minus 1, and when we've seen it at t minus 2, and so on, going back into the past. And he's saying that our pure sensibility, that what we have here at t0 does not present data in combination. And in the first edition, he talks about that combination as sort of bringing all of these past versions of it into our intuition, so that we have some singular concept of this tree, some singular judgment of this is, and then we would have a tree. And so he's saying that pure sensibility does not do this. And so from that he says that therefore it must be the understanding, which, if you remember from the previous videos, Kant sort of breaks things up into two different faculties. So we have the faculty of intuition and the faculty of the understanding. And intuition is sort of our immediate representation of whatever we are experiencing, and the understanding is how we sort of think about it, how it becomes intelligible, how that thing that we are experiencing has any kind of intelligibility to it, so it's not just some splotch of meaningless colors and shapes to us. And so he's saying that pure sensibility, which is in the intuition, does not combine all these things together. So it must be the understanding that imposes the concept of the unity of what he calls the manifold, which is all the different possible representations. So this one and this one and this one and so on, going back to I guess the first time you ever looked upon something. And so it must be the understanding that imposes. It must be understanding that imposes the concept of unity. So it imposes the concept of unity onto the manifold of representations. So that is the first point. So in the way that I am sort of presenting this, the second point is the I think. The I think of apperception accompanies all representations. So I'll just abbreviate that. So it's essentially saying that the unity of our concept here, the unity that we have, this thing is a tree. So the unity of it, of the concept, bringing all this together through the understanding, is always accompanied by this I think, with the I here being the operative part of this phrase. And so it's saying that whenever I am experiencing something and I have some intelligibility of it, there is a single unitary I. So there is a single consciousness which through time, single unitary in time, and time is more comes from his first edition argument where he explicitly uses time, but it's sort of implied here in time. And so when I see the tree at time t minus 1, it's the same me, it's the same I that saw it at t minus 2. And that it is me who is experiencing that, accompanies all representations. So it accompanies the representation at t minus 1 and at t minus 2, and so on. And so that sort of brings what the definition of the apperception is. So I guess we could, if we want to, we can say apperception. Apperception is equal to the unitariness of our experience, and it is the fact that well, I'll just point up to here again, that the experience happens to that I think accompanies all of these different representations that we come to experience. And then so the third point in the way that I'm presenting this here, he says that therefore, so you could maybe see 1 and 2 as being premises, and this as being a conclusion. Therefore, my representations form a synthetic, and I'll underline that because that's important, unity. And he says that it forms a synthetic unity as opposed to what he calls an analytic unity, which would be that, well, I'll state it this way. The synthetic unity means that all of the representations of that tree, for instance, come together into a single concept of this tree. So this tree. And so the synthetic unity says that there is this single concept of the tree, rather than just me knowing that that I accompany each and every individual representation of the tree. There isn't multiple representations of the tree for which I know that all of those manifold representations belong to me. There is a single synthetic unity, and that is this concept of this tree right here. And that's what he means by this synthetic unity. So, number 4, so this synthetic unity, so we'll say that, I'll just call it SU for synthetic unity, is a necessary condition. And remember, that's what we're trying to do, find the conditions that are necessary in order for me to have this intelligible experience of whatever the object just happens to be. I'm using a tree just sort of as an example. Kant does not use the tree example that I'm using. So the synthetic unity is a necessary condition for the possibility of apperception. and are the same conditions for every intuition to be an object for me. So once again, the synthetic unity is a necessary condition for the possibility of apperception. So that sort of unitariness and I guess belonging to me-ness, and are the same conditions for every intuition to be an object for me. I guess that is sort of the for me part of it here. So the synthetic unity is the necessary condition for the apperception and for that for it to be for me. So that is what number 4 is saying. And so then number 5, and so this is a part that Paul Guyer in the Cambridge Companion to the Critique of Pure Reason says is sort of a misstep for Kant, because he says that so he says a judgment, which is sort of what the understanding does. Doing a judgment is sort of the function of the understanding. In fact, he says that there are functions of judgment. And the way I like to understand it is that a judgment is taking X is P, so some subject and some predicate, and actually substituting actual things in for those variables. So that's kind of the way that I understand judgment. So Kant says that judgment is a way of bringing data into objective unity of apperception. Well, I won't write the whole thing out, but he says judgment is a way of bringing data into the objective unity of apperception. So he's essentially saying that, he's essentially pointing at the copula of is. So when we say X is P, he is saying that this is a necessary unity. And so this is sort of a very strong way of defining judgment, which, as I said, Paul Guyer says is a misstep. And it's essentially saying that X brought together with P is an objectively valid judgment by virtue of the necessary unity of apperception in the synthesis of intuitions. And so by doing this in the objective unity of apperception, so in order for us to understand things, this synthetic unity, as I said, is a necessary condition for the apperception, which is sort of the unity of our experience. And so it's saying that that because this apperception, this synthetic unity, is a necessary condition for us to experience things, then by virtue of this necessary unity of apperception in the synthesis of intuitions, that when X is brought together with P in this X is P here, that it's a valid, that's an objectively valid judgment. And so an objectively valid judgment And he uses this example. He says that that if we have a body, which he is just his general form of saying, I guess, something separate than ourselves, is heavy. This is it's always the case, and therefore it is objectively valid. Whereas he says, if we say, if I carry the body, so we're talking about the same external object, I guess. If I carry the body, then I feel the pressure of its weight. And he says this is only subjectively valid. And so you can see why Paul Guyer says this is kind of a misstep by defining judgment as in such a strong way here, because then it's essentially saying that that a proposition like this, or I guess a hypothetical like this, is sort of excluded from all our considerations of the apperception, and so it's kind of a misstep that perhaps Kant should not have taken. He doesn't define it this way in the first edition, by the way, and in fact, if you look at some of his writings between the two editions, you can see sort of the evolution of this idea that then gets put down in the second edition. All right, and so from here, I have as number 6. Number 6, I have a judgment. So this is just his the way that he has defined judgment has objective validity. And so after we've gone through this, then we can go, and I've actually organized what's section 20 in the Critique of Pure Reason, sort of the famous section 20, where he kind of lays out the argument all in sort of a really short section. And I have taken it and separated it into the section 20 into these 5 different propositions, or premises rather, and then the conclusion here. And so the first premise, and so all these premises sort of follow from what our discussion with these enumerated points up here. So premise 1, the manifold of representations in intuition. And so that is, like I said, we have the tree at t0 and the tree at t minus 1 and so on. So the manifold of representations in intuition are necessarily given to us in the synthetic unity of apperception. And so when we look at a tree, it's a single tree to us. It's not a bunch of different representations belonging to us. It comes together in this synthetic unity, and that is because this is since only through this is the unity of intuition possible. Then premise 2, the manifold of representations in intuition are brought together in the synthetic unity of apperception by the faculty of understanding. And so this follows from what we talked about in the metaphysical deduction, that this synthetic unity of apperception doesn't come from intuition itself, which only brings to bear space and time onto objects of our experience. And so the manifold of representations of intuition are brought together in the synthetic unity of apperception by the faculty of understanding. So it's not intuition, but understanding. So I said up here that Kant breaks it down into intuition, which is sort of the immediate experience that we are having, and the understanding, which is how we make all of our various or manifold representations that come to us through intuition into a single synthetic unity. And so premise 3, the faculty of understanding is the logical functions of judgment. And so remember, a judgment is this thing right here, and Kant defined it strongly so that a judgment has to have objective validity, which, like I said, Paul Guyer says that is that's sort of a misstep. And then premise 4, the manifold of representations in intuition are determined, i.e. they are generated by consciousness, for instance. So these different representations are generated by consciousness with regard to at least one of the logical functions of judgment. And so it's saying that that each representation in our intuition is generated in consciousness using, and I added the at least one here, but because in Kant just wrote with regard to one of the logical functions of judgment. And if you remember from the previous video, one of those logical functions of judgment was unity. And so the logical functions of judgment can impose unity on it, because that is one of the things that they do. So premise 5, the logical functions of judgment are the categories of understanding. And that is the thing that Kant determined in the metaphysical deduction, is that the structure of the logical functions of judgment, so the structure of judgment is the same as the structure of understanding. If you remember in my previous video, I made those two different tables on top of each other, where the top one was the logical functions of judgment, and then there were the corresponding categories of understanding that were in direct correspondence to them. And so the conclusion then is, therefore, the manifold of representations in intuition are necessarily subject to the categories of understanding. And so that's saying that each of our representations that are in intuition, so remember we have our intuition here, which gives us our representation of some object. So say there's some object out here, and the sense data goes to our intuition here, and then we sort of generate this representation right here, with intuition imposing space and time onto it. And so the manifold of the representation, so I guess you could almost, as time goes by, this is sort of passing each representation off into memory. And so then it is through the categories of understanding that we sort of bring all those representations together into a concept of that object, into some intelligible form of that object. And so after section 20, Kant goes further to try and show that the understanding is needed in order to make possible our sensation of objects, our experience of objects. And so, say we have some object here, and once again, I'm showing it as having these sort of spatial dimensions, but Kant says that it does not necessarily, the object in itself, outside of experience, does not necessarily have spatial dimensions or persist through time or anything like that, because we can't actually know that, because all we can know is what is from experience. But anyway, sense data from that object goes into, and we'll call it sensibility. And so we have the object here in our sensibility. And then you could, so this is sort of the pure sensibility. And so that is sort of sending it back to the intuition. The intuition, so that's the intuition of that object. That is our immediate representation of it. But we don't just have the immediate representation of it. We have representations, plural, of it. So if we say that that this is at t0, then we have one at t minus 1, we have one at t minus 2, one at t minus 3, and so on. And this is in, so it's tempting to call it a faculty, another faculty in addition to intuition in the understanding, but Kant says that this faculty, which he calls imagination, is sort of part of the understanding, but it's through the understanding that these, so using the understanding, that these can be sort of brought into the intuition, so that we then now don't just have the sensibility, but we actually hold in our intuition the full synthetic unity of the concept of this object here in our intuition. And it is through that, and so I'll draw the arrow sort of coming right from here, so I'll say that this is representation. And so this makes possible the sensation of, or the sensibility of the object. And so it's similar to what he talked about in the transcendental aesthetic, insofar as how intuition brings space and time to bear onto the object. So it's actually intuition that is giving the object space and time. And we know this because we don't need to experience space or time to know what they are. Those are not things that come from experience, but they are a priori. Those are something we have, that they're what we are born with. And so the understanding, which is the categories, is also something we are born with, and so that makes possible this apperception. So the apperception, or the unity, the synthetic unity of our experience, is made possible by the understanding. These categories are, just like space and time, a priori. And so this is Kant's way of thinking about the categories of understanding and why they are conditions that are necessary for us to have this experience of well, an intelligible experience, I guess you could say, rather than just being sort of completely in the moment, just sort of without thought, having just an experience of colors and shapes and stuff that don't have any meaning to anything. So in order for those to be intelligible, the conditions necessary for our experiences to be meaningful experiences is these categories of understanding. And so that is Kant's argument here for the categories of understanding. I'm going to sort of elucidate more what the categories of understanding are in the next maybe one or two videos. I hope you found this video helpful. Once again, I'm going to just sort of leave a pinned comment with essentially just my notes from his first edition Transcendental Deduction. And so you can compare that with his second edition Transcendental Deduction. But anyway, I will see you in another video.